Majestic, dramatic, awe-inspiring. These are the bridges that are worldwide icons, as well as engineering marvels.
She's beautiful.
Each of them broke new ground. The first, the biggest, the longest, and the tallest.
I'm Rob Bell, an engineer, and I'm on a global adventure to discover how and why these magnificent structures were built, and to learn about the sweat and the sacrifice that went into their construction. Well, hey!
I'm going to take you closer than ever before.
Oh, this is magnificent.
Inspect them from every conceivable angle.
Oh, yeah.
And meet the men and women who keep them working round the clock, no matter what.
Check this out.
These are the world's greatest bridges. Sydney, Australia's oldest and largest city, and one of the world's most beautiful waterfronts.
It's known as the Harbour City, and the very best way to arrive here has to be by boat, just as the first European settlers did some 230 years ago.
Sail into the harbour and you'll pass two world-renowned structures, the Sydney Opera House and the Sydney Harbour Bridge. Rising to a height of 440 feet, it's the world's tallest steel arch bridge, connecting the northern suburbs of Sydney with the city centre. It weighs more than 39,000 tonnes, spans 1,650 feet and is 160 feet wide. It carries 8 lanes of traffic, 2 railway lines, a footpath and a dedicated cycle path. Every day, more than 200,000 cars travel across it.
When it opened on the 19th of March 1932, it instantly became a world-renowned landmark. And since then, millions have passed across it, over it, and under it. Like a giant, triumphant gateway, it signals your arrival here into Australia.
The bridge had taken a century from first proposal to completion. The construction itself lasted 8 years and cost £6 million. And its arrival marked a new stage in this young city's remarkable evolution.
Sydney was founded in 1788 when 11 British ships landed, right about here. On board were more than 1,000 settlers, including some 850 convicts. The captain described this as, without exception, the finest harbour in the world. He named it Port Jackson.
Within 4 years of the first shipload, another 4,000 convicts arrived. They were followed by the first free settlers from Britain, who travelled here to make a new life. By 1871, 200,000 people called it home. As the south side of the harbour became crowded, some began settling directly opposite.
The North Shore's so close, look, you could swim to it. Yet to get there by land, you'd have to travel a good 15 miles all the way round. And in the 19th century, that journey would have taken about a day.
The alternative was a ferry. The first service was started in 1816 by an enterprising ex-convict from Jamaica. Billy Blue, as he was known, plied his trade wearing an old naval officer's coat. Demand was such that he soon had a fleet of 11 boats. 60 years on, and Sydney Cove had been transformed into Circular Quay and the hub of Sydney Harbour's ever-growing ferry network.
By 1904, the number of ferry passengers had increased to 19 million a year. 75 ferries were running every hour to keep up with demand. This city's greatest natural transport advantage, its harbour, had become a transport disaster. The solution, everyone knew, was a bridge between the south and the North Shores.
In fact, this wasn't a new idea. Throughout the 19th century, various bridge proposals had been submitted, but had all been rejected by successive governments.
The designs were considered too fantastical, too unsightly, too much of a risk to shipping, or simply too expensive. But by 1900, a solution was needed urgently. So the government launched a worldwide competition to find the best design and construction plan.
30 of the top entries were put on public display here at the Queen Victoria building. Once a market, but now a smart and chic mall. But the judges deemed them all to be unsatisfactory and too lacking in detail. The only answer? A second competition, this time with a much more detailed brief. The bridge had to allow a clearance of 170 feet above the water. The main span needed to be 1,192 feet long, and the deck a minimum of 60 feet wide. It also needed to accommodate 2 railways, 2 roadways, 2 tram tracks, and 2 footpaths. It was this submission from Norman Self that won in the end. A cantilever bridge, a design where the beams are anchored at just one end and supported by large towers. The judges advised the government that construction should start immediately and be completed within 5.5 years. But then a change of government brought the entire project to a grinding halt before it even got started.
The designers were furious. Over a period of 3 years, they'd invested a huge amount of time and money into what they described as the Sydney Bridge guessing competition, and all for nothing. And much to the anger of the people, it was looking like Sydney Harbour would never get its bridge.
The Sydney Harbour Bridge, once the highest man-made structure in Australia and still the most famous.
Walking across, you get a real appreciation of the scale of what's here. But it's not just the size, it's solidly built too. And you get a real sense of that looking up. The width of the steel plates that make up the arches, all the truss work between the arches. Not to mention the imposing granite-faced pylons at each end. It's seriously impressive.
But at the beginning of the 20th century, it seemed unlikely this magnificent bridge was ever going to be built, as the project was hit by one delay after another. Norman Self's design, now more than 10 years old, was outdated, and following his death in 1911, the doors were left wide open for a new generation of bridge designers.
The bridge we see and admire today might not have existed if it weren't for the drive and the determination of one man, John Jacob Crewe Bradfield. And even if it had gone ahead without his involvement, it would certainly have looked very different.
Bradfield began his career as a draftsman. In 1891, he joined the New South Wales Public Works Department and went to live on Sydney's North Shore. That meant travelling to work by ferry, so he understood commuters' demands for a bridge all too well.
As an advising engineer on the abortive bridge design competition, he'd witnessed what a farce it had been. But in 1912, when the government took another look at building a bridge, he was determined to make it happen.
After being appointed chief engineer of the Harbour Bridge and Metropolitan Railway construction, Bradfield submitted 2 designs himself. In 1913, one of these was accepted. It was a cantilever bridge, with each span built out sideways from huge piers. Steel trusses were to be used to give it strength and rigidity. Connecting Dawes Point on the south shore to Milson's Point on the north, it would carry 4 lines of railway, 2 roadways, and a footpath. Although still a cantilever design, it was far more ambitious than any past submission.
The budget was agreed, the design was agreed, and the time frame was agreed. But then, the First World War broke out. The money for the project was diverted to the war effort, and once again, the bridge was cancelled.
It was to take a further 8 years before the state government were once again in a position to consider Bradfield's proposal. Luckily for them, Bradfield was a patient and determined man, something his grandson Peter remembers well.
I think he knew how important it was to weld the city together, to get the east and the north and the south and the west together, and the bridge was absolutely essential. He was a visionary in many senses, always extremely meticulous in everything he did. He didn't have a localised view of things, he had a national view of things.
So dedicated was Bradfield that he travelled the globe to meet the world's top bridge-building companies, learning all he could about the latest construction technologies and techniques. When he returned home, he was no longer wedded to his cantilever design. Instead, he asked the government to accept submissions for an arched bridge.
The main reason Bradfield changed his mind was a practical one. Arches are naturally incredibly strong, and engineers have been using them since ancient times. And nature's been using them even longer. Take this eggshell, for example, or half an eggshell. The shape of it creates a natural arch. And it's incredible for something so small and so thin, how much force it will take before it starts cracking. Let me show you. Right. There we go. Well, it easily takes the weight of the tray, but let's load it up. Bottle of water here. Let's pop that on top. It easily takes the weight of 1 bottle of water. All right, let's try another one. 2 bottles of water, easy peasy. It's the arch that's taking all of that force. Because I'm trying to compress it, those forces pushing down are taken out through the sides of the arch or through the structure of the eggshell and into supports below, or the table in this case. 3rd bottle, let's have a look. 4th bottle, let's see what happens. Taking this up to 2.4, almost 2.5 kilograms of weight now. It's still staying strong. Let's try a 5th bottle. And this is going to take it up to 3 kilos. Will it take it? Our eggshell there took 5 bottles of water, but not quite the 6th. That's 3 kilograms of weight it could take down, and all because of that arch shape. It's definitely smashed.
Before construction tenders for this new arch design were even accepted, Bradfield began preparing the ground. On the 28th of July 1923, the turning of the first sod ceremony took place on the North Shore. What should have been a cause for celebration was, for many, a time of great concern, as 500 houses in the immediate area were compulsory purchased and destroyed.
Some people wrote letters to the government. This one's from a Mr. Lockhart, an 82-year-old who stood to lose his furniture business. He writes, "Dear Sir, my wife wrote some weeks ago RE compensation for loss of home and means of living. In reply, you stated that all the department could grant would be the cost of cartage. The amount is small, but would be very acceptable, as we have no means and are both too old to go out to work." Another letter, this one from a Mrs. Pitcairn, a widow whose daughter taught music at home. She writes, "My one desire is sufficient to get a home again. Indeed, since we lost our home, we've had to sell many things for necessities to keep out of debt." She goes on, "Through the bridge, everything is taken from us. At this time, I had only one wish, to take my own life, and only my religion held me back. Though some people in the government may have been sympathetic to these pleas, they were afraid of setting an expensive precedent. A blanket policy was laid out. There'd be no compensation."
Over on the south shore, in an area called the Rocks, the residents had even less sway. It was this area where the poorer, less fortunate members of society made their homes, packed with tiny bars, brothels and hovels. The government wasted no time driving these residents from their homes before auctioning them off to building supply merchants who demolished them. When it came to the government's shiny new bridge, it was far more concerned with what it would look like than the effects on the local population.
Well, Bradfield had drummed up interest in the project during his round-the-world fact-finding tour, and he'd since received more than 20 designs from companies based in the United States, in Britain, in Canada, as well as here in Australia. And on the 24th of March, 1924, he made his decision. He awarded the contract to the English firm Dorman Long and Company and their consultant designer, Sir Ralph Freeman. Bridge A3, as it was known, would be the largest structure Australia had ever seen. It would be strong and it would look strong. And its granite-faced pylons here would, according to Bradfield anyway, give it an air of dignity.
The design provided for a single great central arch spanning 1,650 feet, crossing Sydney Harbour from north to south in a single stride, and rising at its centre to a height of 440 feet. From this, the trackway was suspended at an average height of 170 feet above sea level, passing off the arch at either end onto a series of 5 approach spans, formed of horizontal girder structures on granite piers.
At 50,000 tons, this would be the world's heaviest structure. The steel sections, and even the rivets holding them together, would be the largest ever produced for a bridge project. 20 years earlier, he'd considered an arched bridge to be a bit of an eyesore. But now he was a total convert and had completely ditched his original proposal of the cantilevered bridge.
Bradfield had been won over to the steel-arched bridge design after seeing New York's Hellgate Bridge. Built in 1916, it was the first steel arch to span 1,000 feet. Although only a fraction the size of the Sydney Harbour Bridge, they bear an uncanny resemblance, even down to the decorative stone pylons.
Bradfield estimated that the steel arch would cost £350,000 less than the cantilever bridge. And with new advances in steel, making it both lighter and stronger, the arch to Bradfield was becoming not just practical, but irresistible.
Bradfield had approved the design by Dorman Long, and now the responsibility for getting it built largely fell to their English Director of Construction, Lawrence Ennis. During a 43-year career, he'd built bridges all over the world. For this latest project, he moved to Australia, describing it as the most difficult he'd ever encountered.
His task was Herculean. It would take 5 years before construction of the giant steel arch even got underway. Before that, there were plans to be drawn up, workshops and machinery to be built, and granite to be quarried.
And eventually, once the work began, there would be those that would give their lives for the bridge. We're giving you the chance to head stateside to visit not one, but 2 of the world's greatest bridges which feature in the series. You and a friend will head to New York for a 3-night stay at Archer Hotel in Manhattan. Whilst there, take a Circle Line cruise sailing under the incredible engineering mammoth, the Brooklyn Bridge. Then jet to San Francisco for a further 2 nights on the doorstep of the Golden Gate Bridge, staying at Cavallo Point Lodge in The Sydney Harbour Bridge. After years of argument and delay, its construction finally started in 1923. But it would still be another 5 years before the famous steel arch would begin to appear. Granite was needed to encase the reinforced concrete twin-towered pylons standing either side of the arch. 290 feet high, they don't actually serve any structural purpose. But Bradfield insisted on them because they made the bridge look reassuringly sturdy. The first step was finding a nearby granite quarry accessible from Sydney. And what better way to look at what they found than from the air?
The granite itself came from just down there, at a place called Moruya, about 170 miles south of Sydney by sea. It's been quarried here since 1850, and it's once described as the best granite outside of Aberdeen. An incredible 9,000 square kilometres of Australia's southeastern coast is made up of granite. So why did they choose Moruya above all the other sites? Well, the answer was quantity, quality, and ease of access to the Moruya River.
3 steamships were built specially to transport the rock down the river and then across the sea to Sydney. But first, it had to be mined. At the time, Moruya was a tiny community, and they didn't have the necessary skilled manpower. So Dorman Long went on a recruitment drive. John Gilmore was one of the workers they signed up. In 1924, he, along with his wife Mary and their 9 children, moved from Scotland out to Moruya. The work was hard and the hours long, but soon a bustling community was established next to the quarry in an area that became known as Granite Town.
In its height then, roughly how many people would have been living here in Granite Town?
Over 300. At the height of the works too, there were 64 children at the school.
So paint a picture for me then. What would we have seen here in Granite Town if we would have been here back then?
There were 72 cottages made of timber. There were bachelors' quarters for the single men. There was a post office, a cooperative store, a school and a hall.
So this became its own community then, did it?
Yes. They would enjoy social activities in the hall. So practically every Saturday night it was the place to be. They'd have concerts. The Italians had a band, and the Scottish enjoyed the dancing.
And then the quarry itself was quite nearby, was it?
Yes, just over there.
It's just over that hill.
Yes.
I mean, it's really close by.
Very close by. When they would blast the rock away from the quarry face, there are memoirs of people recording of things falling off shelves. And,
Really?
Yes.
Because of the vibrations?
Yes.
It's this very same quarry which provided the Sydney Harbour Bridge with around 50,000 tonnes of numbered stones. Each one dug, shaped and then shipped to their destination 200 miles north. And whilst I'm here, I can't resist trying my hand at a bit of stonemasonry.
What were the techniques those quarrymen were using to get the granite so beautifully and so pristine for the Sydney Harbour Bridge?
Once they'd produced that large block from the quarry face, then they moved it out as far as they could and then started cutting it up into smaller blocks using feathers and wedges. We've got a bit of a demonstration set up for you on a smaller section of stone.
OK.
So holes would have been drilled in the line where you wanted to cause the split, and the feathers and wedges, or feathers and plugs, they go into the hole.
OK.
And a wedge would fit between them.
So the idea was, the feathers here, they sit down into the rock, down in the hole that you've drilled, and then as you drive the wedge through, I mean, you can see what happens there. The feathers get separated, and ideally then that's separating the rock on each side of it.
That's right. So the feathers are designed and the wedge so that there's equal pressure on both sides.
So we've got our feathers and wedges all nicely lined up here along the line we want to split the rock. Is it brute force now?
Yeah, it's brute force now, yeah. Just remember a few taps on each one, about the same strength, and go along to each one and then come back again.
OK.
And keep on doing that process until it splits.
I'm actually quite excited to get involved and see if I can split this enormous chunk of granite with just what is a relatively small tool in my hands here, but done the right way. Fingers crossed. Right, let's give it a shot.
Yeah,
That's not too hard?
perfect. No, that's
OK, good. So, yeah, this feels like it is quite a nice, delicate process, actually. So now I come back through.
Yes.
Well, hey! Is that gone all the way through?
Yes.
It's definitely started. Let's have a look.
Yeah.
This dude's talking to me.
Yes.
Whoa, look at that. Look at that. And look at this beautiful, clean granite.
So that's the finish that I imagine Bradfield looked at and said, yeah, that's the finish that I want to see on that pile.
Really, it wouldn't have needed much more work than that on a nice, clean split.
Yeah, if you can get it exactly right for all the bridge work.
I mean, that is stunning, though. I'm so pleased with that.
Over 7 years, a total of 173,000 blocks of stone were produced this way, each of them hewn, cut, dressed, and arranged into position like a giant jigsaw puzzle before their shipment. The quarry also provided the bridge builders with a further 18,000 metres of finished stone and 200,000 yards of crushed stone for use in the concrete foundations. Foundations on which the bridge could finally take shape.
Now, the bridge starts and finishes, rises and falls here from this super-sized hinge. Now, there are 4 of these in total, 2 on this side and another 2 on the other side. And you need the flexibility of these hinges. You couldn't have it locked down into the concrete foundation, not just because of the phenomenal winds that blow through here, but also because of the way the steel expands and contracts in the Australian sun. On a really hot day here, the arch can rise an incredible 18 centimetres. Without these hinges, there'd just be too much stress on the steel, causing it to bend and buckle and eventually fail.
As well as expansion, a steel bridge of this size exerts a weight of around 20,000 tonnes on each hinge. So the hinges had to be built on top of huge angled foundations. Work on these foundations began in 1926. 4 large holes, 39 feet deep, were dug and then filled with a special concrete mix. In order to bear the enormous load of the bridge without cracking, the concrete had to be laid in one continuous 14-hour pour.
Once the foundations and hinges were in place, work could begin on these, the towers or pylons, each of them encased in the granite from Moruya. And only then could they finally begin construction of the arch across the harbour. And not before time. By 1928, this stretch of water was dangerously crowded. A few months earlier, a ferry full of schoolchildren collided with a steamship. It sank immediately and 40 people drowned. For the people of Sydney, the bridge couldn't come soon enough.
But there were still big challenges ahead, not least how to support the arch as it was built across the deep waters of the harbour. The task fell to Dorman Long's consultant designer, Ralph Freeman, a long-standing expert in this field.
Until the 2 ends of the arch being built from the north and south shores had extended enough to meet in the middle, Freeman needed a way to support the weight of all that steel sticking out from the land.
The answer came from the famous Zambezi River arched bridge beneath Victoria Falls, which Freeman helped build in 1905. In order for the arch to be built across the deep ravine, Freeman devised a system using thick steel cables anchored in place to hold the arch up on both sides whilst it was constructed. A method he now intended to use with the Sydney Harbour Bridge.
The cables ran down through these iron pipes, which are fixed into this concrete saddle, before heading down into a tunnel 40 metres deep and being pinned into the ground. Just as the foundations and hinges are critical today for the bridge to stand up, this saddle, the tunnel, and all 1,600 miles of steel cable were essential during its construction.
Although the 2 sides of the arch were worked on simultaneously, the southern end was built slightly ahead of the northern end to detect any errors and help with alignment. The steel girders were hauled from barges by 2 specially built creeper cranes, each weighing 575 tons. As they put a new panel into place, they crept out onto it to put the next section in. Assembling the bridge was a mammoth task, involving some 1,400 riveters, boilermakers, steel constructors and riggers every year. The work was hard, and it was hot.
It was also dangerous. There were no handrails or steps like there are today. Instead, men would climb up on the rivets, or using one of these so-called podgers, kind of pointy-end spanner that they'd jam into the rivet holes and use as hand and footholds, a bit like mountaineers. But even before the archers had left the ground, 7 men had lost their lives.
The first 2 recorded deaths were at the Maruya granite quarry. The earliest was in April 1926. A man was sitting on the body of a crane when it swung round and severed his leg. The second came less than a year later, when a large block of granite toppled from a ledge, crushing one of the workmen below against the quarry wall, killing him.
In all, 16 men gave their lives building this bridge. Nearly all of them were killed as a result of construction accidents. Only 2 died falling from this steel arch.
But amongst the deaths, there were also some incredibly lucky escapes. The most celebrated involved that of a riveter named Vince Kelly.
Vince was working on the road deck level, about 150 feet above the water, fixing rivets with his powerful pneumatic gun, when he slipped and fell off the platform. As an experienced diver, he instinctively knew his best chances of cheating death were by straightening his body, pointing his toes and raising his arms above his head. By turning himself into a kind of human spear, he'd reduce the impact as he hit the water at more than 80 miles an hour. But still, his chances of survival were less than 1 in 10.
Remarkably, Vince's technique worked, and he did survive, breaking 6 ribs, but otherwise none the worse when plucked from the river. For his extraordinary feat of survival, he was awarded a special commemorative gold medal.
Despite the risks, the bridge would become a lifesaver for many others. Before the 1929 Wall Street crash, which sent the world's economy spiralling into depression, unemployment here in Australia was already 10%. Afterwards, it more than doubled. But this construction project continued to provide job opportunities to men who otherwise may have become destitute. It kept on breathing life into the city. So much so, it was given the nickname, the Iron Lung.
As the economy worsened, working hours were cut so more men could be employed. In such desperate times, seeing the arch gradually stretch across the harbour, the 2 sides getting closer and closer, gave Australians something to be proud of.
Finally, on the 19th of August 1930, the 2 halves of the arch touched for the first time, right here in the middle of the bridge. It'd only taken 2 years since the start of construction, but at long last, Sydney North and Sydney South were united.
Up high on the bridge, Bradfield and Freeman joined Lawrence Ennis, the man who'd overseen the day-to-day management of the construction. It was Ennis who made the first crossing from south to north, along the lower chord of the arch, 400 feet above the water. It would be another 2 years before the deck was fitted and the bridge declared open to the public. But in private, a feud was simmering between 2 of its key players, Bradfield and Freeman, which would soon explode into bitter and open warfare. Remember, there's still the chance to win that trip to the States, giving you the opportunity to admire the Brooklyn Bridge in New York and the Golden. Before the world-famous Harbour Bridge, there were 2 Sydneys. After it, there was only one, united by a monumental arch that rose above the water and the rooftops. When completed in 1932, it brought together 300,000 residents on the North Shore with another 600,000 on the south. Today, the population of Sydney is in excess of 5 million, and over 1 million vehicles cross the bridge every week. To cope with this relentlessly heavy use, a large team worked round the clock to ensure that the 485,000 square metres of steelwork remains properly maintained.
I just love getting in behind the skin of these giant structures. This is where you learn how the whole thing lives.
Part of the maintenance program includes repainting the exposed steel sections every 5 years. A team of specialist painters used 30,000 litres of bespoke Sydney Harbour Bridge grey paint just to complete one coat.
There's, I think, 6 million rivets on this Sydney Harbour Bridge. We've got about 85, 90 maintenance workers, which includes painters, riggers, carpenters, boilermakers, and it's still not enough.
Back in the late 1920s, concerns over the bridge's future maintenance couldn't have been further from people's minds, as controversy over who actually designed the bridge was gaining momentum. John Bradfield, the chief engineer, had without doubt been the driving force in getting it built, and it was his proposal that the government had finally accepted. Ralph Freeman, the consultant engineer for Dorman Long, felt he was entitled to at least equal credit. He'd produced all the detailed plans, calculations and drawings, as well as providing the solution for supporting the arch during its construction. But this had all been done under the close scrutiny of Bradfield.
Grandfather spent hundreds and hundreds of hours and a team of people checking every calculation that the contractors did and signing off on every calculation that was done for the bridge. The bridge wouldn't be built unless Grandfather had been there from day one, and he was. It was a 30-year project, and the bridge is where it is today, why it's there today, in the form it's there today, because of his overall supervision.
Even during the final stages of construction, Bradfield was ever present. He appeared in all the official photographs and wrote articles for the public and engineering community. To the world, he was the designer of the Sydney Harbour Bridge.
Freeman wanted recognition of his own, so he wrote to Bradfield, pointing out that he'd been working on the design since 1921, and added, "I ask you to use your influence as far as you can to prevent publication of the statement that the design of the bridge is yours." He went on further and demanded that you would personally like it to be known that the designs of the bridge submitted with Dorman Long's tender were prepared under my direction. A polite but strong request. Bradfield was unsympathetic. He replied, "We're producing between us the steelwork of a structure of worldwide significance, the details of which are prepared by you, but are subject to my revision before approval." And he went on, "Your request that I should proclaim that the design is yours would be incorrect if construed in any sense."
When Freeman sailed from England to Australia in 1929, he confronted Bradfield, who refused to back down. An exasperated Freeman went to the papers.
When the story broke in the Sydney Morning Herald, it was a scandal. Freeman's claims were astonishing. For years, Australians had celebrated Bradfield as the designer of their bridge. Now some unknown Englishman had come along trying to steal the glory, not just from a local hero, but from their country itself. Neither man would back down, both of them taking to the press to state their claims and attack each other. In fact, the argument became so heated, the Institute of Civil Engineers threatened them both with expulsion should the so-called newspaper controversies continue.
As the argument raged, the workers on the ground got on with what really mattered, the actual building. When the arch was complete, the creeper cranes worked their way back down, constructing the roadway and other parts of the bridge from the centre out. Horizontal crossbeams were attached to vertical hangers which hung from the arch above. The deck for the roadway and railway, over 3,772 feet long, was built on top of the crossbeams, with the deck itself being completed by June 1931. Rails for trains and trams were laid, and the road was surfaced using concrete topped with asphalt. Power and telephone lines and water, gas and drainage pipes were also all added to the bridge in 1931. And on the 19th of January 1932, construction came to an end. 3 weeks of testing followed, including load testing using 96 steam engines positioned end to end.
This bridge is so incredibly strong. Even if every roadway, every railway and footpath was completely rammed, you would happily take it. It's been tested to withstand a 100-mile-an-hour hurricane and a temperature variation of 120 degrees.
In March 1932, it was finally ready for its grand opening. The dispute over who designed it rumbled on.
In the end, a compromise was reached. As the plaque here says, the general design and specification were prepared and the whole supervised on behalf of the Government of New South Wales by JJC Bradfield. Freeman's name's also included. Here, look, Ralph Freeman, as consulting and designing engineer for the contractors.
The plaque gives future generations the chance to acknowledge the hard work of both men, a point not lost on Bradfield's grandson.
I think the thing that's clear, and grandfather recognised this, was that not one person could build the bridge on his own. I mean, the bridge involved a huge amount of determination, ingenuity, engineering excellence, and not one person could provide all those things all the time. But I think that he has the most claim to say that the design was his, but Freeman's role can't be ignored.
The bridge opened amidst much pomp and ceremony. With most of the population of Sydney in attendance, the Premier of New South Wales cut the ribbon, signifying the opening of the bridge.
After the official ceremonies, the bridge was opened up for the public to walk across for the very first time. And incredibly, up to 1 million people did so. That was about the population of Sydney at the time. But the first to be driven across in a car was Dr. John Bradfield.
At a time when there were only 30,000 cars and trucks in the entire city, the bridge could carry 6,000 vehicles and 160 trains every hour. Every person in Sydney could have crossed in a single afternoon. And as planned, the new bridge drastically cut the number of ferry passengers from 47 million before the bridge opened to 20 million. Massive, majestic and breathtaking, the Sydney Harbour Bridge was one of the great engineering challenges of its day. It not only altered the life of a city forever, it became a symbol of a bold young nation and a changing world.
Ralph Freeman was without question responsible for the precise design. But without Bradfield, it wouldn't look like this. It wouldn't stand in this precise location, or perhaps even be here at all. Whoever has claim, it's impossible today to imagine this city or even this continent without the Sydney Harbour Bridge. In my mind, it's one of the engineering wonders of the modern world.
Stunning, and Rob's back next Friday at 8. Next tonight, Bettany Hughes takes on the Roman Empire. Her epic, dramatic tale of 8 days that made Rome continues with the day Spartacus broke out of gladiator school with a mission: revolt. It's gripping stuff. Stay right where you are.